Conservative media done right. You're listening to the SHR Media Network.
Get ready for truth bombs, belly laughs, and the kind of accent that turns car into a two-syllable adventure. Here's your host, Sean.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to a special edition of the Edge of Liberty right here on the SHI Media Network. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. In a minute, I'm going to start an interview. The interview is 2 hours long. When I say 2 hours, it's 1 hour, 59 minutes, and 48 seconds. It is a long interview, and I am going to post it in its entirety by itself to the podcast on Spreaker, Apple iTunes, whatever. I interviewed Lisa Ekman, who was a former Democrat, lived and worked for years in the Democrat bubble, and then had her awakening and wrote a book called Deprogramming Democrats. And for that, I'm going to hand it off to one handsome son of a gun. And I will stay in chat and chat with you guys all night. Thanks, Sean. Damn, he's good. So hold on one second, ladies and gentlemen. I'm being told there's no audio. So give me 1 second. I'm trying to fix that. I don't know why that's going on. Let me share here again. I had this all figured out. At least I thought I did. I got it figured out. My apologies, ladies and gentlemen. Let's start it yet again right now. Thanks, Sean. Damn, he's good looking. So I am with, and I'm glad to be joined by Lisa Ekman, who is a former Democratic lobbyist and policy advocate in Washington, D.C. for 20 years and a recovering lawyer. I want to make sure that I throw that in there so you get the credit you do. And I support you in your struggle, and hopefully you can find happiness and wellness soon. Who then turned around and wrote a book that is just fascinating to me, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to go through it. Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elite, How I Escaped the Progressive Cult. Lisa, thanks so much for joining us.
It is my pleasure to be here, Sean. Thank you so much for having me.
So you born and raised in a Democrat family?
Definitely. My parents were what I would call JFK or classical liberals. They believed in freedom, they believed in equality, they believed in the American experiment, and raised me that way. They believed, they believed in government, in the possibility of government doing good and government being necessary to, correct some historical wrongs. But there are also, as liberals were, I used to call them hippies who didn't do drugs, because even though that's an oxymoron to a lot of people, but that was really them. And they
say no to drugs.
Yeah, be you, but don't. I mean, they just didn't do them themselves. They didn't, go around anti-drug crusading or anything.
Right.
But it was just sort of, the time. And so they raised me. They loved Jimmy Carter. They hated Ronald Reagan. They raised me to believe that. They wanted, a fair, equitable, and I should say equal society, because not equity but equality. And they were first wave feminists, both of them, which is very different than the third wave feminism that we see today, which we can get into later if you'd like. But they believed highly in education as a way to improve society, and believed in that more the more educated you are, the more they believed you would support a stronger government. And so, as you mentioned, I'm a recovering attorney, but I also have a master's degree in social work and then a bachelor's degree, so I spent a fair amount of time um, in academia, which I think is a root of many of our problems, which we can also get into later. Um, but that, I lifelong liberal. I volunteered on Michael Dukakis's, ill-fated campaign. As my first political action, and then continued to be a devoted Democrat who used to bleed blue. I used to say, when I went to Georgetown to get my law degree, I was president of the Law Democrats at Georgetown, which can't get much more blue than that. And I would have been one of those people who would have been vote blue no matter who.
Right.
Because
Which we see a lot of today, especially in our youth, which I know we'll talk about. But go on, continue, please.
well, yeah, and I mean, you completely saw that in operation in last year's election when someone got substituted on the ticket without getting a single vote because someone else could no longer be there, and everyone was like, "Yeah, that's fine. Democracy. I got to protect democracy, so
No,
I'm gonna."
but we can have a queen.
Yes, exactly.
Yep.
I mean, you also saw it in 2016 when, not that I was per se a Bernie Sanders supporter at that point, but he was completely uh, pushed out, by the
Railroad.
Democratic establishment, even though he might have gotten the votes. So
Yeah, Bernie was railroaded, and that's not a secret. That's something else that always amazed me with the Democrat, and it didn't come up this last election as much as I thought it should have. Bernie got railroaded by Hillary, and because I'm a big believer that she stomped her feet and said, "No, this is my time. I deserve this." And like we say, a lot of us say it, and I am a firm believer. Whether you like Bernie or not, at least Bernie's always been Bernie, right, wrong, or indifferent. He doesn't change that much. He hides how much of a communist he truly is, but Bernie is always Bernie. Whereas everybody else, it seems like, on that platform, and we just saw Gavin Newsom yesterday do this, and this is how I know it's the beginning of the election season, is Democratic politicians are starting to change their background and history to meet what they think the populist wants, which is what killed Kamala too.
yeah, and I think we can talk about this more too, but I think that if I went back in my memory, I could remember a time when Democrats did actually seem to stand on principles.
Mhm.
And I don't think that that's the case anymore. I think it's all about how do we maintain power, and we'll say whatever we need to say in order to get it, and to win these votes, and then the ends will justify the means of what we're trying to do here. And so yeah, I think. I was about as enshrined sort of in the democratic machine as you could be without being in the true inner circle. I was never, I would say I worked my way to the outside of the inner circle. So
Right.
I would be at parties with the president, but he would make an appearance and not mingle and just say hi. Or I was in lots of meetings when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House with the Speaker and her staff, but she wouldn't have known my name, directly, or call me for advice or,
But you
counsel.
you were on
So
the bubble. That's
yeah, it was right on
that's
the
the DC
bubble.
bubble. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and so I saw kind of how it operated, and there were opportunities sometimes where I could have maybe made more money, but I would have not been working for a cause even at that point that I really supported. So I stuck. I used to say they pay me the medium bucks, because wasn't making the big bucks, but I was making decent money. But it was I used to think I found a way to actually do well for myself while still doing good. I don't look at it that way anymore because even though most people would say disability policy, you're trying to help people with disabilities. That's what I focus my work on. That's a noble cause, and it is. But I think because I took that cause in general to expand government programs. Often, you know, discounting, despite evidence, the abuse that does happen in some of those programs to defend them. I'm not sure I was actually doing good while I was doing well, but I did, I wasn't going after being the most powerful. I wasn't going after making the most money. And often, in order to get to those real inner circles, that has to be what matters to you, and
Yes,
that isn't what mattered to me. So,
yeah, you got to sell your soul. To go back to on how you're saying you're looking back and however noble you obviously had some reservations with what you were doing now. I think it's very common for people who have an awakening, and I don't care what kind of an awakening it is. It's an awakening in your life where all of a sudden you've made changes for the better for yourself. I think it's very easy to go back and kind of play fruit of this poisonous tree doctrine, right? Where you can say, well, I did this and I did this, and then everything after that is just not, it's tainted because of what I did. And I do think you're being a little unfair for yourself, especially having a son who is disabled. I think that I'm sure that there was work that you did was very beneficial to a lot of people. And, as I get older, I try to glom onto the good things in life that, especially nowadays, sometimes is fewer and further between. So give yourself a little grace there.
well, I appreciate that, Sean, and I do my best to. And one of the things that I also, and I talk about this in the book as well, is that people on the left, often because they lack any sort of spiritual or religious faith, are very unfamiliar with the concepts of gratitude and forgiveness. And so to be grateful that I had the opportunities to do that and to forgive myself for some, especially forgiving your own self. But I mean, you can see that, what happens when you see videos of people online or at protests. People on the left seem to take any little offense and just get so upset about it, and never try to put themselves in the other person's shoes, and never forgive these transgressions that they think have happened to them. And
Yes.
so part of my awakening and my journey has been to um, develop these senses of gratitude and forgiveness, and hold myself accountable, because that's another thing missing on the left
Oh,
is accountability.
yeah.
um
Unbelievable.
and so, um while I may at some times say things like I did here that make it seem like I don't, that I'm way too harsh on myself. I think part of the awakening process requires that kind of self examination. And, part of what I had to do was figure out, how the heck did this happen to me? How did I fall down this path of indoctrination and brainwashing, and to make sure I understood it and that it would never happen to me again.
Which is why you wrote a book.
Correct. Yeah.
And I want to get into the book because like I said, from what I've been able to go through so far, it's really enlightening. It's one of those, and I hate to say this, it's gonna come off wrong. However, it's just nice to be validated, right? A lot of what we've been saying on the right for years now, you identify, admit to, and really start to go into the weeds with it, so to speak, as to what's going on. So you open the book by saying, admitting you're wrong about everything is next to impossible. What was the moment you realized that the worldview, politically especially, that you built was all of a sudden starting to crack and come apart?
So I'm gonna have to tell a little bit of a story to get to that point.
Thank
But
goodness, 'cause that's why we're here.
yeah, it happened. The grand awakening really was COVID, and I think that is not uncommon for a lot of ex-Democrats you might talk to these days. But I need to go back a few years. And, I lost both of my parents within a couple of years of each other due to illness. And they were relatively young for people of their socioeconomic background, in the early 70s, which is quite a bit younger than you might expect. And my dad, what happened, he had a surgery that went catastrophically wrong. And he ended up functionally quadriplegic and in adrenal failure. And so he ended up living 5 years after that happened, but they were very hard years, and he needed help doing just about everything. And my mom, who already had multiple sclerosis and was somewhat limited, was his primary caregiver. And so, yeah, it was quite an eye-opening experience. And my experience with what I now call our sick care system did not go very well and opened my eyes to quite a few things. But while my mom was taking care of him, that happened to him in the end of 2008 is when he first got sick, and 2009 is when he had his surgery. And the stress and the financial stress that this put on my mom, she ended up being diagnosed with stage 4 of an extremely aggressive cancer in 2013. And this was about a year before my dad ended up passing away. And so she got the diagnosis, and, the doctor gave her the get your affairs in order speech. You probably only have a few months maybe to live. At her age and that stage of this cancer, the 5-year survival rate was about 6%. So, so she said, I am going to do traditional treatment, Lisa, but if there's anything else I can do to help improve my chances to live, I'll do it. Will you research for me? And, this was right up my alley. I worked with these agencies. I did work on healthcare for people with disabilities. And so I said yes. And I said, the first thing I'm going to say is don't do any research yourself, because you're not going to get anything that's going to keep you in the right, frame of mind for survival. So I started digging in, and the truth is that we know an awful lot about what causes cancer. And we know an awful lot about what to do to treat it that doesn't involve conventional treatment. But our medical establishment does not teach any of this, does not recognize any of it. And then quite frankly, all of this information is a threat to their business model, and the chemotherapy is extremely profitable. But I'll put that on the back burner for another conversation, because basically, what happened is, I found these 2 books. One focused mostly on nutrition and its role in helping your body fight cancer, and the other one focused on nutrition some, but also on the emotional and psychological and stress and trauma ways in which you can help your body, deal with cancer. So my mom got surgery, and she started her first round of chemo, which was 6 treatments. And I got her to a naturopath, and we changed her diet, every product she put in her body, on her body, what she cleaned her house with. We did guided meditation. We did focused breathing exercises. We worked on addressing her stress. And after 3 treatments of chemo in that first round, they did scans and they did her cancer marker test, and she was cancer free after 3 treatments completely. And her doctor was like, whoa, I've never seen this happen. This is a miracle. You're amazing. At the same time, he said, yeah, eat whatever you want. It doesn't matter. But, that's a whole other story too. But basically, she was cancer free for 2 years, Sean. And then a tiny growth came back. And her doctor switched her to more aggressive chemotherapy. And one treatment fried her kidneys, and she died within a month.
Holy cow.
Yeah. So thank you. And this was devastating, obviously, for all of us. But, she was of a generation that you did what the doctor said, even though I said to her, look at what you did, and maybe she was getting a little lazy about her diet, or, and I'm not blaming my mom, but you know what I mean?
I understand what you're saying.
When the little tumor came back, you get scared, that's what happens. And they use that fear to get you to take these treatments. So my mom passed away, but, so much of what I learned in that research just didn't sit right with me in terms of all the work that I did and all the agencies that I trusted. Based on what I learned, our USDA food pyramid was upside down and backwards and didn't make any sense. Some of the drugs that that the FDA approved and chemotherapy, hadn't really gotten better in 50 years. Our cancer outcomes hadn't really gotten better, but we were just developing new and different and more and stronger, and we basically poison people with chemotherapy and radiation and hope that we're killing the cancer, but not that enough of the good cells that they die. And
And
so,
I have heard the change in diet be unbelievably effective. And again, it's hard, like you said, don't do the research yourself, because unless you know what you're looking for, it's hard to find the right information because it's all buried. And
it is.
we can talk about the internet's hand in the Alphabet company and all the other ones who suppress information when they're asked to or paid to. Which is problematic in of itself. But I've also heard about the stress level reduction, and we don't realize, I think, as a people, what stress does to our bodies and how bad stress is for us. So kudos to you. And I'm so sorry. Gosh, that's so tragic. And I lost my dad when I was young, so I can't imagine doing that twice. I'm fortunate that my mom is still alive. So I mean, my heart goes out to you, especially. I can't imagine how devastating that was.
Well, I really appreciate that, Sean. And it was definitely the hardest thing I had ever been through until I woke up, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it was really devastating. And it was, what I like to say is, it started to create cracks in the dam of delusion that was holding the flood of truth back from me about our government, the reality we live in, and the illusion I had about reality and the government. So, flash forward now. So that was 2016. My mom passed away, and I went back to work with those very agencies. So I couldn't really have these doubts and these questions. And overwhelmingly, the people who work in the government are good people. They're trying to do. They believe they're doing good, and I wasn't
That's true.
holding these things against the individual people I was working with. So I went back to work. But at the same time, I was starting to get really disillusioned with DC as well, because when I first got there, I arrived at the tail end of the Clinton administration, and there was, I worked directly for an appointee in an agency at that time, and the conversations I was involved in on the Hill or at federal agencies, there was still a, a belief in the good faith of people on the other side to try to come to some compromise, to have good faith conversations in which you may not agree about everything, but you wanted to incrementally make things better, and you might compromise in ways that, hey, I got a lot of what I wanted, but I have to give this, so the country's going to be better for it.
Well, and I think you
Senators used
see
to
that a
eat
lot
dinner.
more on a public scale. Just how you had the speaker there, Newt Gingrich, at the time, had a conversation on a regular basis with Bill Clinton, right? You had all of these people, they'd go out golf together. Even if they disagreed, they could respect each other and find the good in each other. Even if, I mean, you could be the most hardliners in the world, and you look at some of the people that Reagan palled around with in the 80s, and even you look at both Bushes, and they both had friends from the other side of the aisle. Some of them, and I think we start getting into the uniparty a lot with Clinton and the Bushes, where it's all kind of two sides of the same machine. But that completely has fallen away in our society.
100%. And I would put two factors that I really see as being a big part of that. One was the election of Barack Obama. He was definitely divisive. He did not try to unify us.
But he
And
said it with a smile, so everything was fine.
well, and I think, yeah, that was part of it. And then the second thing, though, is the very technology we're talking on right now. The more, so I think people were a lot less political back then in a lot of ways. You had the opportunity to actually in person meet people who thought differently than you, but they were at your church, or they were at your bowling league, or they were at your other civic organization. Um, and people had a lot more time, seemingly, to sort of spend time with people in real life. And it's a lot harder to demonize someone who, you laugh over a gutter ball with, or
At a barbecue.
enjoy their apple brown Betty at the church picnic with,
Right.
And it's so that happened. And then social media, which came out starting Facebook around 2005, I think, really started to change that as well. And people, so they became more politically aware, they became more siloed, and they started to get put into these echo chambers of hatred in many cases. And again, I'm going to come at it from the left because that's where I was. I think it is probably as prevalent on the right in different ways. And I 100% agree with you. It's a uniparty at this point. It's two wings on the same bird, and they flap. One wing flaps louder to give you the illusion of choice, and then the other one does, and then we end up being the ones that, might as well be the paper lining the bird cage,
Yeah,
because that's
exactly.
what comes our way. But
Which is
so
why everybody hated Trump when he came onto the scene, because he was not a wing on the bird. He was just outside the cage.
he was, and he wants to destroy the cage,
Mm-hmm.
and that obviously the establishment powers that be were threatened and reacted, and we saw what happened there. But so I started to become disillusioned with that, especially it, before my dad died. I was having conversations with him about maybe it's time for me to move on to something else, and one of the things was maybe to write some books, to become an author. And the other thing was a professor, which I would still do that now, although we'll talk about that in a minute, I'm sure. And there's challenges, a lot of challenges there. But so I was becoming disillusioned, and I had actually scheduled my retirement for March 31st of 2020, 6 months before that, because I wanted to give my organization a lot of time to find a suitable replacement. And I focused a lot of my work on Social Security disability policy, and it's a very narrow bench of people who have a lot of deep knowledge there. So it wasn't going to be simple. You could find a lot of people with lobbying knowledge that was good enough, but not a lot of people had the sort of substantive, specific law knowledge on the programs. And I had nearly 20 years of experience, so they were trying to find someone who would fit. But so if you remember back to March of 2020, we were just at finishing up 2 weeks to flatten the curve. We were
I
in the
was gonna
height
say,
of the lockdowns. And I sadly will admit I, was buying everything that was being thrown at me at the beginning. I was scared. I bought masks, although I will say I woke up early enough to not really ever use them. But I didn't want to hurt my neighbor. I didn't want to kill anybody's grandma. So I was doing what it was I was told. And my partner, Jamie, who was my boyfriend at the time, he was not buying it. So he and I were going at it a little bit, verbally, as you might imagine. But the other thing that happened is those cracks that were started to leak a little bit when they started making recommendations that made no sense to me. And, the first one, and the one I think that is really easy for most people to understand, was, and I just even recently had a conversation with someone who said, hey, they didn't actually tell us this, but the amount of revisionism in people's memory about what actually happened at the beginning
mm-hmm.
of COVID is crazy.
Oh
But
yeah, they act like we weren't there. That's the amazing part. There's so many. I call them the Branch Covidians. There are so many of them that act like we just weren't there at all, or they gaslight you into thinking something entirely different happened.
yeah, because here's what I said. At the very beginning of COVID, they were telling you couldn't leave your house, right? If you
Mhm.
weren't an essential worker. And one of the best things you can do for your health is get vitamin D, go out in the sun, get natural vitamin D. But even within your, like if at the very beginning, if you had a yard, you weren't even supposed to be allowed out in your yard. And this person was like, well, I was in California. That didn't happen. And I was like, in California?
Most certainly did.
And,
And
and
I'm here
so
now. I was here then, and I can tell you that I was the first, maybe the second one on my street to start saying, screw this, I'm going outside. And then when it started to get to the point that we found out that people were snitching on one another, and I was in California, we were under the national or the emergency declaration, yada, yada, yada. I started going out at midnight to go for walks and kind of sulk into the shadows so nobody would shame me or try to like have me arrested.
and this was a conversation I had today, Sean, that
Holy cow.
someone said that didn't happen. And I was like, yeah, it actually did.
Very much
But they can't. But this was one of the things that was starting to raise my hackles about, like, what in the world? That doesn't sound like great health advice to me. In fact, that sounds like the exact opposite of great health advice. And in doing some research, I learned that actually, back many years ago, they used to actually take hospital patients up onto the roof in order to get sun for them to help them heal. But that's a whole other story too.
We'll do that interview another time.
Yeah, so there's that piece, right? And then the 6 foot social distancing came out, and there's no science behind it, and I looked for it. And then, just each and every one, like, oh, wear a mask, don't wear a mask.
Wear
How
a
many
cloth
times did you
mask that
see
you can make
someone
at home.
doing this, and it's
Yeah.
like, oh, that really helps. But
Wear a
so
cloth mask you make out of socks at home, and that's totally fine. Like, we were just going off the rails.
we were. And to me, I spent my life, I worked for a lot of nonprofits and causes that didn't have a lot of money. So my reputation, and being the one who knew the law and knew the data and knew the evidence, that was what made me successful. Because in Washington, you can have power and money, or you can also be an expert that they rely on, and you always know your shit, pardon the expression, but you always know your shit. And I was one of the people who didn't have the power and the money when I walked in the room, but I made people know their shit because they knew I did. And so when you're coming at me with these recommendations and they have no data or evidence to support them, and then throw in my face, I am the science. We're moving at the speed of science. How dare you question science?
I
It
am the
started to raise
science.
more cracks in that dam.
I am the science. Just from a pure PR standpoint, you look back to and you're like, how did he have the audacity to turn around and say something like, I am the science, and not think that somebody wasn't eventually going to have an issue with that?
Because it's a cult-like devotion. It's a religion. It is not. We have scientism in this country. We do not have science, and we can talk about that in a minute because that's a big point in the book as well. But
I believe we call this foreshadowing.
Yeah, foreshadowing, a prelude to the next conversation. But so there were these cracks coming in, and then came the censorship, Sean. Then came, the outright evisceration of all of our natural born rights enshrined in the First Amendment. Freedom of speech is number one. And when I first heard the word disinformation come out of a government official towards our American citizens, it sent a shiver down my spine, almost literally, because that is not a word the government uses towards citizens in a constitutional republic with a First Amendment like we have. That is a totalitarian word. That is a communist word. That is not a free word. Um, and that started, and then, and they started censoring a lot of the natural health providers I had started following after I did all the research for my mom. And they were censoring people asking really reasonable questions, and they were completely trying to shut out things like the Great Barrington Declaration, where you had tens of thousands of doctors, scientists, researchers saying, hey, maybe we ought to take a different approach, like protecting the most vulnerable, like we usually do, instead of shutting down the entire society and creating these consequences that we will never recover from. The people who lost their small businesses during the shutdowns, never coming back.
Children. The
Children.
psychological well-being and the educational well-being of children that fell so far behind that we
Yeah.
are still trying to get caught up. And they used the climate control playbook to sell COVID. That's exactly what it was. It was the same thing, just copy and pasted.
And it was. And it's the same thing, like we'll come back to the science conversation in a second, because it feeds into all these other things. But so this was happening, and I started to really start questioning, like, who are the good guys here? Who is telling the truth? And I was a competitive debater in high school. I was a competitive debater in college. I have a law degree. And all of this training told me that if you had the data, you had the evidence, and you had the truth, you should never be afraid of people talking.
Right.
Because you prove your point. That's what you do. You argue your point. And if you're right, you're right. And so if you're shutting down debate, I got a lot of questions about whether you even believe you're right, or whether you don't. So, so that happened. And, Jamie and we started going at it more and more over time. And, in some ways, the more I started having doubts, the harder I fought, because when you are programmed, and fear is being used to make you very afraid, to control you, your reptilian survival brain goes into overdrive, and it shuts down your critical thinking. It causes your brainstem to do all your thinking for you, which is that stress reaction. The cortisol takes over, and you will do anything to prevent your reality from being destroyed. And your subconscious knows that, hey, if I admit this, all these other things are going to fall too. And so it'll push back really hard to prevent that from happening.
It's emotional fight or flight is what it is. You get to the point where you dump and you get audio-visual exclusion, and you're only focused on that one goal, which at that point it was to still be right, even though there was a massive amount of evidence perhaps starting to point the other way.
And my brain was telling me it was survival. This was, life or death, even though it is metaphorical, not literal life or death. But it was. The person I was died on the day when I woke up, and we can talk more about that. But so Jamie and I were having a discussion one time, and he was making a really good point. And I said, Jamie, I can't believe it. I can't believe that the agencies I worked with all these years, the people that I worked with all these years, would do this to the country, would do this to the world without data and evidence to support it. And he looked at me dead in the eyes, calmly said, Lisa, he wasn't always calm, but in this particular moment, he was calm. And he said, if they'll poison our water, what won't they do? And my brain just kind of went, stopped. Because
that's an unbelievable point in that moment.
It was. I already believed it. I had a reverse osmosis filter, and people still won't give up they won't admit the fact that fluoride in our water should not be in our water. Same thing today. Someone pushed back on me about that. So I said, you know what? This gets into another science thing, but I don't need to go down that road. But basically what happened is my brain broke. I couldn't think my way out of it. It's like, if you're going to prove things that for something so fundamental that we can't live without, then how can I argue that you have my best interests in mind? How can I argue that you rely on data and evidence when there was never any data or evidence to support that fluoride in the water actually helped our teeth, and that it didn't hurt our IQ? It's like, the dentist tells you that if you don't brush and leave the fluoride on your teeth for 2 minutes, that it doesn't do its job, but it just going right by your teeth, that works perfectly
That's
well.
totally fine.
Yeah,
That's totally
fine.
fine.
But that gets to, the whole thing is that I was able to hold a great deal of cognitive dissonance. I could have two ideas that really didn't go together, because if experts told me these two things were true, then I had to believe them. That's what my indoctrination and brainwashing told me, is that if an expert says it, it's the truth. You don't question it. And the longer you're in school, the more you stop questioning what the teacher, what authority says. So, but it pushed the cognitive dissonance to the point that my brain couldn't take it. And so I looked him in the eyes. Oh, and then he followed that up with, if you don't believe me, prove me wrong. If you don't believe me, show me the data. Show me how I'm wrong. Which again, clicked
Given your
something.
background.
Exactly. I said, I think I may have screamed this. I may not have been calm in this moment, Sean. I said, fine, I will. And I started doing more research. And I did research not on Google. And I did research where I went to the 9th page of results first instead of looking at page 1, because the algorithm does that to you too. It does technically give you the result, but it's at the very end that no one looks at. We can talk about that more too later, but and then I just went down rabbit hole after rabbit hole, and my entire reality disappeared, and everything I thought was true came into question, and everything about who I was came into question. And that was how I woke up. That was my awakening moment. And, I said up until my awakening, losing my parents was the hardest thing I'd ever been through. And this, it was really hard because, I based my entire identity, my entire self-worth, my entire self-perception on two things: my democratic progressive identity and my brains, and so one of the things that education also gets you to do, and that the indoctrination also gets you to do, is to sublimate your intuition, to not listen to your gut and your heart, and to only listen to what authority and your brain, which has been programmed, tells you. So I just lost everything I relied on to be me, and then I had to call into question everything about myself. And so I started over. And the first thing that happens is you think you're going crazy. You think you're losing your mind, for goodness sakes. And I share this story sometimes, I remember one time, not too long after I had woken up, Jamie put on a Tucker Carlson segment. And before I woke up, I hated him. I was like, oh, what an obnoxious conservative, who thinks he's all that. And his laugh used to bother me,
It bothers
so
everybody
cocky
who doesn't like him. They always go
and
after
arrogant. But I was sitting there and I was going, oh my God, Tucker, makes sense. Everything he's saying makes absolute sense. Am I losing my mind?
Mm-hmm.
I hope one day I get to share this story with him, because he was part of my awakening, and he was, but that just tells you what you go through. You think, was I crazy then, or am I crazy now? And the answer is neither. You were programmed and you were indoctrinated. As I say in the book, you're not losing your mind, you're reclaiming it. But that process is extremely hard. And, also you gotta make amends with yourself about, one of the things that I think I make a point in the book, and, I try to make the point that this was me too. So I'm, it's a mea culpa, I take responsibility for it, but the left has an extremely elitist attitude. And they look down on people who don't have an education. And as we'll talk about in a second, I think that very education is the reason why you're not thinking straight and not using critical thinking. at all. But, you know, I said a lot of things, not to people. I've always been very nice to people, but I would say a lot of things about people on the right that were not very nice, Sean. And, you know, I always prided myself in being a kind person. But people on the left are they are programmed to believe they know better. They're morally superior.
Yep.
And, you know, it wouldn't be uncommon for me or my colleagues to say things like, well, you know, those poor country folk, they vote against their self-interest all the time. And most of them haven't spent 5 minutes talking to a
Hmm.
person who lives in the country to understand what their interests actually are, you
It's
know?
how they get terms like flyover country, right? That's how
Hmm.
that became, because it's like, oh no, those peasants are just peasants and we know what's best for them. And they're so silly with their tractors and their farms. And, you know, meanwhile, if you've ever met an old farmer, odds are he could probably fix 95% of your life problems in about an hour if you talk to him long enough and ask them, you know?
Yeah, no doubt about that. But, you know, and maybe now's a good time to kind of get deeper into the education system and what it actually really does,
Yes.
because basically it values one type of intelligence and one type of intelligence only. And that is the type that can, first of all, be controlled. And second of all, regurgitate information in a way that will get you a good grade. But it does not value technical intelligence. You know, after waking up, I moved to a farm, and Jamie and I have a farm now. And, you know, when I lived in DC, I paid people to fix everything for me. If something broke, you pick up the phone and someone who you pay them a lot of money so they come fix it. Well, when you live on the farm, you get to do a lot of that yourself.
Hmm.
But school doesn't teach you any of that. It used to. You used to have the option to go into some more technical programs, right?
I I can remember in junior high school there was a carpentry class, a basic electricity class, and a homemaking class where you actually learned how to cook a little bit, how to sew, how to like balance a checkbook, things like that. And then I went to a vocational school for high school, so I spent 1 week learning how to build houses. I was in carpentry, and then the next week was my academics, and you know you went back and forth. And I tell people that now, especially younger people, and they swear I fell from another planet and that I went to school on Mars and that it doesn't exist because they can't comprehend working with their hands even.
No, same thing. Yeah, home ec. You know, I talk to people about that. I was financially literate both because my parents taught me to be, but also because of home ec class. You know, and my economics class that I took in high school that focused. We I think spent a month on personal economics
Mhm.
and, you know, credit cards and what is the compounding interest, which a lot of young people should really understand what that means before they take out student loans. You know.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, but but so those kind of things disappeared, and they created sort of this one track. Either you're going to be this successful person who goes to college and it's just this type of knowledge, but that requires you also to shut down your intuition. It doesn't value creativity, it doesn't value inventiveness, it doesn't value emotional IQ or any of those other things. It's just about
Or
taking
even
these tests.
entrepreneurship.
Or what?
Even entrepreneurship isn't valued the same way anymore.
No, it is not. In fact, it's kind of shown as, well, that's really risky. If you want to have a secure, safe future, you have to get this degree.
Risky
And
and selfish too. They often make it a selfish thing. Like, well, you're just going to do that for yourself, so you make all of this money, and you, and how dare you?
when at the reality is like, as an entrepreneur, you have an opportunity to actually treat your employees well. If you get to the point where you have employees, and you could even offer them partial ownership if you wanted to, but that's all up to you. And what it really does is it takes, you know, some of the control reins off of you that those of us who worked in office jobs and things like that, you know, have to give up some of that freedom, you know. So, but what it also did, so it basically convinced everyone that you have to go to college to succeed, and if you go to college, you will succeed. That first part is completely untrue, because I know a lot of successful carpenters, HVAC, technicians. I use this example because we have some solar power on the farm, and we had some issues with our solar system, and we couldn't find a technician to come out because there aren't enough.
Mm-hmm.
But meanwhile, we're pushing everybody to get this alternative energy, and there. Basically, most companies that install it won't service systems they didn't install, and the company that installed ours went out of business. But a simple service call for an hour is $250. Well, there's a lot of people who could probably make a lot of money doing solar, but they're being pushed into college programs that, quite frankly, often the degree is not worth the paper it's printed on in terms of getting return on your investment.
When your focus in college and your degree is in underwater basket weaving and lesbian interpretive dance, you're not necessarily going to get a large job field that you can step into and start being productive with.
No, and so we
fund it. That's the best part, is we fund it and give these loans for this stuff where we know there's no ROI on it whatsoever.
Well, I think part of it was that they had to do something when they decided to enter into this globalization where they shipped our jobs overseas, and we decimated our manufacturing base, and we made ourselves completely dependent on other countries for pretty much everything we do. And how did we replace these jobs? We didn't. But we told people, if you go to school, you'll be all right. And when I graduated from college, everybody who had a degree got a job. Not necessarily in their field, but it was usually decent paying. But that couldn't be kept up. There weren't that many good jobs that we were creating. So we sort of sold this lie to a couple of generations. And so I do feel for some of the kids who bought that lie and took out these loans. I don't think I should have to pay them back for them. But,
I agree.
But I do feel for them, and I also feel for them in the economy they find themselves in. That's themselves in. That's a whole other story too.
Yeah, we'll get to that after academia. We'll solve the economy problem after that.
Yeah. Well,
you're right.
We did get back to that, but
we did send everything overseas, and then the jobs that were at home, you had so many of them starting to disappear that were blue collar, quote unquote, jobs, and Biden tell people to go learn to code. But academia, these kids get told, and like you nailed it perfectly, if you don't go to college, you'll never be anything. And then they go to college, and college, if I'm not wrong, and universities now have turned into, I'm going to teach you how to pass tests, and then the rest of the class, I'm going to emotionally outrage you and tell you everything you should be angry at, and you're going to listen to me because I stand at the front of the room.
Yeah, I can't really disagree with what you just said, Sean. I might put a little bit of a different spin on it. I think that 90% of your professors are going to be Democrats, and probably 70% are going to be socialists or communists who believe in deconstructing America and changing it into something that it's not. And, the longer you're in school, the more you're led to believe that you don't question authority, you don't ask questions, and that you only listen to experts who have education, who have the quote unquote experts, credentialed experts. So if they have the degree plus they have the license or the certificate or whatever it is the government now requires for them to have a job, basically, then you're not to be listened to. You don't have any authority. You can't be trusted. You can't be a good source of information, and you now become an expert yourself. So now you have the credentials to be able to, right? And so on, and it's a self-reinforcing.
There we go. That was the exact word I was going to use. It's self-reinforcing. We've seen this with other communist nations in the past, and that's how communist revolutions have happened in other countries. I always equate it and break it down very, very simple. If you walked into a doctor, and a lot of these kids now would not argue this, but if you walked into a doctor and said, "Hey, I have this, sinus infection that just won't go away. I probably need some antibiotics," and he goes, "Oh no, we're just going to cut off your left foot, and then you'll be fine." A lot of these kids would come hobbling out of the hospital, not questioning. They're like, "Well, the doctor said so." And it goes back to like the 1800s when you were getting they'd put like a metal nail in your ear if you had a headache for more than 2 days and, give you cocaine and send you out the door.
That might actually work better than some of the things that they're doing now, Sean, but that's a whole other story, right? But you're not
Yeah, try that
wrong.
tomorrow.
I'm not giving you any medical or legal advice at this point, Tom. So just to be clear, you can take the lawyer out of practice, but I still think that way. No, but the point is that you're right. It's that if someone in authority told you this is where we got into trouble in COVID, they told us, so we have to do it, even though it doesn't make any sense. But they create a monopoly on knowledge that way, and they and then you get what I call scientism, and you get the progressivism religious cult, which is that they worship authority and they idolize the expert. And so this is how it's, almost religious in nature.
That's the
And
indoctrination.
it is indoctrination, and it starts in grade school and goes all the way on up. And I mean, science used to be like, it used to be something you could say that's objective, it's rational, it makes sense. Well, a true scientist has no investment in the outcome of his or her experiment. They come up with a hypothesis and then they test it through the scientific method. And if the data supports their conclusion, then they say great. And if not, then they come up with another hypothesis and they test it.
And they don't mind being questioned. That's the other thing too, is true scientists don't mind another scientist coming in and say, "Well, why did you do that? Or how did you get that when you could have done this?" And then a true scientist can turn around and say, "Well, either A, I thought about that and here's a rational, logical answer, or B, you know what? I didn't think about that. So let's apply that and see how that comes out."
Yeah, because truth is the ultimate goal, not money. And the other thing is that, I mean, if you just take what we just said, the whole peer review process is anti-science. Because you should be able to publish your results. And the thing is that you also are they're supposed to be repeatable. So you should do a number of experiments that all show the same data. And then you should be able to publish them and then have people try to replicate them or show that they're not replicable. But what happens is, let's say you come up with this groundbreaking theory that is going to upset your entire industry. Well, every single peer that reviews your data is about to lose their entire livelihood and all their life's work if they say, "Yeah, you know what? He's right." And so you're never going to get that published. And then you look at most scientific studies, and here are the two things that, out of my awakening, I would encourage everybody to do. First is question everything, and second is follow the money.
Always
and when
follow.
you look at 99% of studies, they are funded by the people who are trying to prove that their product is good or prove that whatever. So,
and then when anyone dare questions it, they just attack them mercilessly. I always think about the doctors that came out during COVID, and they had, you had a bunch of different well-credentialed, educated doctors who are practicing saying, "Well, wait a minute, this doesn't work because of X, Y, and Z." And they were just, nobody said, "Well, hear them out." Everybody said, "How dare you?"
Exactly. How dare you question the experts? How dare you question the narrative that is being shoved down your throat? And I mean, and beyond just saying "How dare you," they reported them, and a lot of them had their licenses pulled.
Yes.
They got deplatformed,
Hmm.
debanked. The whole cancel culture thing happened to them because they dare question the scientific orthodoxy.
Right. No
And
kings unless it's Fauci. That's what the left always says.
yeah, I mean, or queens who are
Well,
appointed during the election process.
so
But
So when you're working in DC, because I do want to make sure that I keep the academia, I want to prove the academia point because you're 100% right about it. When you're working in DC and you're working with these nonprofits and you're working in the bubble, obviously you guys get interns, you get these youths that are coming out of university or college and they're coming to work in and around you guys. Do you see a difference from? And I know it's hard when we were young and coming of age, so to speak, in our early 20s, but do you see a difference on how they kind of viewed even government, the world, all of that compared to how maybe even you did as a young person?
oh, completely. I mean, I don't think that young people today, and there are some other things I want to talk about academia before we move on, just
Oh
because
yeah.
I think it's important to understand. But um, I don't think young people today are ever taught the Constitution. I don't think they are ever taught the what our Bill of Rights is and how unique it is in the history of the world. And, I'll use an example, and I talk about the Patriot Act and also the TSA in my book in terms of the disappearing Fourth Amendment. Um, I think the war on drugs started it, and slowly they just chipped away at the warrant requirement. And well, if a police officer believed he had a warrant or a probable cause, then we should allow the evidence, good faith exception, right? There are
Right.
all these things, and they just started chipping back and chipping back and chipping back until there's no expectation of privacy whatsoever in young people. And if I ask them what the Fourth Amendment is, a lot of them couldn't tell me.
Right.
Um, and I also think, there
But they'll
is,
listen to TikTok lawyers.
oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for
It's
sure.
amazing. It's
Um,
amazing.
yeah, I mean, social media is a whole, could be a whole, 2-hour conversation in and of itself in how it is affecting people. Um, but so there's that piece of it. But I also think that there is sort of like, truth to the participation trophy argument and like a lack of a work ethic that I think in part maybe came from some of those other kinds of classes that we had where you actually did do some work. And just sort of this culture of entitlement that I see. Entitlement combined with victimhood and a lack of accountability. And I do think a lot of that does come from school. When I started researching for the book and looking into education, I got my last degree. My law degree was in 2009. I graduated from Georgetown, and I really do think that in the last, I guess now that would be 16 years, things have really, really changed at university. So, um, universities police what they call microaggressions, and you can get in trouble for a microaggression.
Yes.
Um, and again, without a sense of forgiveness, this is like feeding the outrage machine. It is looking for racism and looking for homophobia and any kind of ism or phobia that you can think of in everything that comes at you. What they also do is completely remove the implication or the importance of intent in what someone says
Hmm.
towards whether or not you should consider it racist. And I use this example in the book. Let's say you're at a brand new mixer at a university, and I, as a white woman, walk up to a black woman and ask her, "Oh, where are you from?" She could think that's a microaggression, that I'm assuming she's not American.
Right.
This is something I would ask anybody. I'm just trying to figure out, are you an East Coaster or a West Coaster?
Right.
Where do you come from?
What kind of
What's
pizza you
your,
like? Deep dish or East Coast style, right? Like
exactly.
that's getting to
But
know somebody.
because of her lived experience, it's a microaggression, and universities will actually come after you for doing this. Okay.
So insane to me.
Combine this with safe spaces,
Yep.
which I think the only group maybe that couldn't have a safe space is white men, but anybody else, nope, you're a man, you can't come in. It's, female only. Nope, you're straight, you're cisgendered, which I
Do
don't
not
use that
accept that
term.
word.
I'm
Yep.
just using that for,
For an example, right?
for
Yep.
example, because I don't think I have to put anything in front of my sex to make it my sex. It's always been my sex.
It's so insane to me that we're even in the point that we could have words like that.
Me too. But, language is really important, and it's how they have moved us from where we could have a sense of humor and where we could joke around about things and where my words were my words and didn't get me canceled, slowly from political correctness all the way to where we are now, where it might not only get you canceled, it could get you swatted and,
Yeah.
and all of that.
It's become beyond just being canceled now and having everybody just turn you off, or everybody on the left, where now they're looking for instant punitive damage to the person that they agree with, and they will use whatever means, including law enforcement, digging up something from 20 years ago. And it's funny, I just want to interject this story to kind of bolster what you're saying. Last week, I went to dinner at a local place up the street, sat at the bars watching the game. And this young kid who was 28 years old, his name was Danny, and I just remember that because he was a really good kid. We started talking about just society, and he went to college, he went to high school, and he said he could not believe how many friends he was not able to keep because he had a different opinion. He came from a conservative family, he's a conservative guy. How many friends outright said they hated him for not thinking like they do, and how much trouble he had in college with professors when he learned to essentially just shut his mouth and get his degree and walk out the door. But anytime he disagreed, they would not have a debate or a discussion as to what he disagreed for. It went right to attacking him as a human being. How dare you be this monster that you are for not complying and agreeing?
And that really hits, it hits right home at what I was talking about. And there is this moral superiority about this belief that you can't possibly care about other people if you believe the way that you do. And it comes from, that is the indoctrination, but it is also the fear. In a lot of these cases, I'll use gender ideology for this, because it's easy one to sort of put out there. They have convinced trans people that there's a trans genocide going on, and they have convinced their allies that this is the case too.
Right.
And so when you believe this is about survival for an oppressed, vulnerable group, how could you possibly not think that someone who is against that is a bad person? They want these poor trans people to die. And I think part of that is, one of the things that is part of a cult and part of indoctrination is the restriction of information that opposes the view that you have, the belief that you're supposed to have. And so that's what has happened in colleges when you have 90% of professors, and a lot of that 10% is in your hard sciences and your economics and mathematics. So if you're
I'm just kidding.
No, if you're in gender studies or you're in social justice, or I don't even know what they call all the majors these days.
Collective Justice 101 and all this other stuff.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's probably closer to 100%, Democrats. So, and if they, teach you anything conservative, they'll use some ludicrous, in their mind, conservative viewpoint and just tear it apart, meanwhile teaching you all of the communist and critical theory of everybody else. So
they'll also tell you Che Guevara was a wonderful human being too in the same breath, which is amazing to me.
yeah, and they will. That's the other thing, is that what I've noticed about, young people is when you try to talk to them about, hey, can you tell me what the Bolshevik Revolution was and how many people were killed, or can you talk to me about the Cultural Revolution in China, which I spend a fair bit of time talking about in the book, because we have really serious parallels to that going on in our country right now. And we're actually in the pretty late stages of it. It kind of began at the same time as the one in China did, but they were already communist and they already had a great deal of control, and we didn't. And we had a very strong, our Constitution is founded on individual freedom, natural born individual rights, which is completely incompatible with any communal or communist system. And so, but slowly, as I said, we now no longer have a Fourth Amendment. It's gone. And so we're hanging on by a thread with our first, and
Right.
they keep coming after our second, which is the way we enforce our first in the event. And I do not advocate violence. I just want to put that out there. And I thank the creator that the people on the right seem to have a lot more emotional control than the people on the left, because they often are very armed and willing to defend what our founding fathers created for us.
Well, and I think though that's the difference right there, is a lot of us, even if we haven't gone into the weeds and reading too much into like the Articles of Confederation or something like that, you look though at the founders' writings and you look at just the basic intention, especially with the first, the second, the fourth, the third is just they didn't want the soldiers living in people's houses. But you look at those three alone, and if you dig into what the founders really thought about those were the foundation for what this country would be built off of. Those three specifically. It kept government out of your house. It kept government out of your life. It kept government from being able to just come in and do what they want. It allowed you to question government. It allowed a press that could question government, even though half of them don't do that anymore. They just go along with what they say, but that's neither here nor there.
They never did, Sean, but that's chapter 4 in my book.
But and what it said for the most part was, hey, these aren't rights the government gives you. These are rights you're naturally born with. Therefore, they cannot be taken away by any government. And you, the individual, have your liberty within the confines of the country without an oppressive government. And that's what our founders wanted, which is why they have attacked the founders, especially going back to academia. How often do you hear about this now, where they have painted our founders into these hateful, horrible, bigoted, unbelievably rich human beings. Were they flawed? Sure they were. They were human beings like the rest of us. None of them were perfect, but by the standard of the day that they were living in, they were living 200 years ahead of time. These founders and the circles they kept even were living so far in the future. They saw so many things that were going to happen, and they tried to safeguard us, the individuals, from government in doing so. I mean, yeah, Ben Franklin, like chasing around older married women. That was like his really, like, that was the worst thing they found on him. Okay, well, that's a very human thing to do one way or the other. It may not be the nicest thing to do, whatever. But yeah, George Washington had slaves. Everybody had slaves at the time, and how they were treated were entirely different from a lot of the founders, right? I mean, we all hear the stories about how Jefferson hung out with his slaves, right? Some of them had a really good relationship with them. But they forget that when you step back in time for the founders, the world that they were living in and what they were trying to accomplish. And yeah, sometimes they gave up things like, all right, we'll deal with the slavery thing later, just so we can form the nation now to fight the bigger threat. And then we'll suss out our differences. The whole world was involved in the slave trade back in the day. Some people forget there are African and Muslim countries right now that are still involved in the slave trade. Nobody ever wants to talk about that. So academia overlooks all of these things, the Northwest Ordinance, where the country was starting to grow north and west, and they essentially said, hey, any other new territory, there will be no slavery allowed in that. And that was what, 1802, I think the Northwest, 1798, I think the Northwest Ordinance was written in, right? All of those founders get demonized now by academia as horrible, unbelievably uncaring, rich, aristocratic jerks.
They do, and that is another perfect example of what I think has happened. And the whole thing is, if you're trying to destroy this country, to move it into a socialist, which always ends up being communist, country, you have to undermine these basic fundamental rights that we have, and you have to be willing to do that. And the best way to do that often is to destroy the story of the people who created them, because we end up talking about how awful they are as opposed to, yeah, I do really want to live in a world of free speech. And it's also the way, though, that you using fear and also undermining our founding story is the way that you get people to be willing to give up their free speech rights, which we really have seen happen. And also, quite frankly, it leaves me a little bit concerned about where our current administration is. Hate speech is constitutional speech. It is protected under the First Amendment. And so I have some challenges around that. But I did also want to get back to one other thing that I don't know if you can hear my hounds in the background.
Let the hounds go. Love them.
Yeah, we have 4 Dutch Shepherds. They're amazing.
Holy moly. So yeah, that's a full house. Dutchies are beautiful.
Yeah, they're amazing dogs, but they're a lot. My last point I wanted to say about colleges is about trigger warnings, about these.
Oh, yes.
And so in case anybody listening doesn't, basically if a professor is going to teach some content that might be offensive or might be traumatizing or might, be a trigger for someone who has had some trauma, they have to warn the class about it. And if you believe that it would just be too much for you, you don't have to read it. And so the whole point of, at least I thought, college was to expose you to viewpoints that you find challenging and all of that.
Yeah, watching them get rid of books like To Kill a Mockingbird, that the entire book was to be uncomfortable as a learning experience, is mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, but the right is the censorship. We want to burn books, which we don't. We just don't want kids having access to sexual content, no matter who is in that book. I don't care who they love or who they try to kiss. Exactly. I don't think it's appropriate for a child. But so combine the things we were talking about. You got your policing of microaggressions. You got your safe spaces. You got your trigger warnings, and then my favorite that I like to add is the free speech zones at colleges, which I thought the whole country was that. But what you end up with is extremely sensitive kids who believe that they are entitled to tell you what you can and cannot say, and just have this sense of entitlement, as well as the inability to deal with any difference of opinion without it being a moral failing, and without it, triggering some sort of extreme reaction in them. And I think that's what you see today. And none of those things were really there when in 2009, I think a lot of this happened with Obama, the rise of diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, the rise of critical race theory being taught. And
I was going to say, I think one of the biggest points with Obama is when everything started to become racial. Started with Trayvon Martin. That could have been my son. The Professor Gates incident in Cambridge University, where they try to make it about race. Meanwhile, cops are dude randomly shouldering a front door of a house in a major city where he doesn't know everybody who lives there. And having worked in law enforcement for a long time, I can tell you, we call that a FBI clue if somebody's trying to kick in a front door that they probably shouldn't be there, or somebody inside probably doesn't want them there. But both of those incidents, we had the beer gate, we had all of that, were just put to the forefront of all of a sudden now everything is a racial motivation or a demographic motivation, instead of taking things individually as they are and dealing with them individually.
Yeah, I 100%, agree. And I think I saw that turn, during Obama's term too. I mean, I think that, obviously there has been and still is racism in our country.
Oh yeah.
But I feel like in the 80s and the 90s, like people, it's not that we didn't see color. I mean, I knew people were black. I just didn't care. Like,
Right.
if you're a good person, if you treat me good and we can have a good time and laugh, you're my friend. And if you can't, you're not. And
Right.
we really were getting to a point where, in most instances, I would say race wasn't really that much of an issue. And we had gone, we had affirmative action and we started to see some equaling out of a lot of things that were unequal.
Right.
At the same time, we saw, I think, the rise of a trend that in part was, I guess, maybe sort of pushed a little bit by welfare reform. And that was the hollowing out of the black family.
Yep.
And if you want to
LBJ.
know, the single biggest predictor of success or failure for a child is whether or not they come from a two-parent household.
Mhm.
And we started to say, I mean, we saw a complete evisceration of the black family. And, you know, I this is not to be harsh on single parents, especially not single moms. They do an incredible job. It's very challenging, but there is no way that one parent can do the job of two. And there is no way that a mom can teach a boy how to be a man.
Well, and I'll give you a great example, and it's my personal situation. The mother of my children and I are no longer together. Um, and I don't like calling her the ex-wife because I think that's so demoralizing. She's the mother of my children. She always gets a different place than everybody else in this world. She's still special. No matter what happened between us, that's neither here nor there. And I am fortunate at how well we co-parent, and we don't even have really a custody agreement per se. It's just like, hey, whoever they're at, and we both want to spend time with them. So it's not like I cannot understand where this mindset of no matter how your relationship turns out of, well, it's not my problem, it's just their kid now. That blows me away, and I blame a lot of the fathers, or I blame a good amount of fathers for not staying engaged. And I know some of them are 17, 18 when they become parents, don't care. You've made your choices. You have a responsibility. You should not need that responsibility to be weighed on you. It should be purely out of love. I mean, that's really what it's supposed to come from. And are there absolutely mothers out there that use the separation as a reason to file, for custody, and then they go off the child support? But sure, there are, absolutely. But the same token, there's plenty of fathers out there who just dip out as soon as they can, and that makes me absolutely furious. And it's done a lot of damage. And like I said, my situation is an example. You can be divorced and still both be great parents and be involved, and the child is supposed to become bigger than everything else in your life.
Yeah, 100% you can. I think that when you combine single parenthood with extreme poverty, you get a pretty bad situation, usually, and bad outcomes, usually for the children involved. But I think the point, I'm trying to remember. Oh, yeah, is that things started to get worse in the community, and then Obama started making everything about race, and then social media really kicked off, and you get in your echo chambers, and then you combine it with a media that is pushing a narrative around police violence,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that is very inaccurate, and gun violence that is very inaccurate. And
And
then
ignoring other violences.
yes, ignoring all sorts of other violence that's going on. I mean, I have there's a section that I have on media bias at the end of chapter 4 in my book,
Mhm.
which uses some examples, and gun violence is a perfect one of those because if you want to talk about the vast majority of gun deaths, they are young black men killing other young black men, but
Mhm.
we don't have any conversation about that because it doesn't fit the narrative. Because we want to use it to scare people. We take these very rare, high profile, a person shoots on people they don't know, that aren't involved. And gotta plug in here, sorry.
Nope, you're good.
That they don't know that could happen to you because it's they're um
Well,
whereas
it's the
all of
boogeyman
these are,
theory.
huh?
It's the boogeyman theory. They just
it,
create a
it
boogeyman.
It
Uh,
is the boogeyman. Yeah, and I often say to people, just because the boogeyman isn't real doesn't mean the fear isn't. And
Agree.
fear is an extremely powerful motivator and control mechanism. But then the other group that we really ought to be talking about if we want to talk about firearm deaths are white men who commit suicide. And
Mhm.
we don't have any conversations about that either. But those are really, and in the case of the black youth killing each other, the guns are already illegal in most cases. So,
I
we
think
don't want to have that point
92% of
either.
weapons used in black on black crime, 92% of them, I think the last I checked, were illegal weapons that they should not have possessed. And the other, you brought up suicide, which is obviously tragic, but it also is something that gets added into gun violence numbers every single time. And that is one of the biggest cooking of the books in a social argument, because that's what it is. It's a social argument now. It shouldn't be. It should be a constitutional argument, but it's become a social argument. That number is cooked into those books tremendously.
Yeah, I think it's close. It's approaching 50% of the
Mhm.
gun deaths are suicides.
Unfortunately.
But that gets to another point that, I think about a lot of the topics we're talking about, our youth, suicide, is that we have a really severe mental and spiritual crisis, really, in our country. Um, we are so, in some ways, connected to each other, like you and I are talking to each other all the way across the country, having this conversation. But we rarely get together with people in the same room and have conversations. So we are so disconnected in a real way from one another, and we no longer have a sense of community in the same way that we used to. So many of the things like I think we were talking about this before we started recording, Sean, but a lot fewer people go to church, and you used to have your friends at church, and um, how many people are in bowling leagues or in the Elks Club or all of these different things that used to, you know, we didn't care about someone's politics.
Yes.
Did they bring a nice dish to the community potluck? Did they volunteer, to help raise money for the community? Did they do these other things? And it didn't really matter, who they pulled the lever for in the voting booth, but we're losing that. We've lost that sense of community.
Well, and it's funny because just thinking back growing up, I couldn't tell you who any of my parents' friends voted for. Maybe a few I knew voted for Reagan, just because usually when the parties were over and it's just that core group of 2 or 3 people, they were talking about politics. But it was never, I mean, you brought up all of these different social interactions that used to be that no longer are, right? And if your children were in sports, if your children were in any activity, academic or otherwise, you had that circle of friends that were there with the parents, would all hang out and talk and get along. I can remember house parties being a much more normal thing, right? where you didn't even have a reason, or everybody had a Christmas party, or everyone had an event for Halloween that you all bounced around to each, your aunts, your cousins, your friends, whatever. 4th of July, the same thing. I tell people this, I'm fortunate that my best friend lives across the street. And his family all lives relatively close. Every Sunday, we do a kind of a family dinner. And we all eat dinner together. We all talk together. We all sit afterwards in the living room and just converse about each other's lives, what's going on, tell jokes or whatever. And it's something that I appreciate, surely. But when I start telling other people that I have that, they're like, oh, man, that's a great idea. And I'm like, yeah, it is. It's been going on for centuries. Like,
Yeah, I
you
mean,
can have this.
I think that, some of it is that people are just so stressed out and work so hard, and that a lot of it is just they don't have the mental capacity to host these kind of things.
Mhm.
But I also think, the ability to communicate like this makes it less a priority for a lot of people. And I think, I I use the word broken, and I don't necessarily like to use it sometimes, but COVID broke us. It
Yes.
broke us socially in a way that, there are a lot of people who seem to go through the motions. They might go to the concert, or they might go to their kid's sporting event, but we don't interact in the way that we used to. And we don't, yeah, the idea of just getting together is just not the same as it used to be. I mean, I used to have a dinner club that I was in for many years
Mhm.
where we rotated who hosted, and we usually have a theme, and everybody cooked something, and it was just sort of, a way to get together. And um I think there were I used to be a competitive pool player, billiards, and the first one I was in was pool players, and we were of every political background and age. I think the youngest one in our group was 28 and the oldest one was 72 for our dinner club. And a lot of the people in it weren't great cooks, but it didn't matter. That was not,
You weren't
usually
eating
there was
dinner to
enough
eat
edible
dinner.
food. It was okay. Yeah, we
Right.
got enough food to eat.
You were there for the company. You were there for being able to enjoy each other's company. You just knew whose plates to avoid, and you take a little bit off of, and you put it off in the corner, and that would be it.
Exactly. Or we found out that one person could really bake good desserts, and we just encouraged them to always do that because their entrees weren't the greatest, whatever. But
Yeah.
it was the social thing. It was getting together, it was breaking bread, and it was like, it creates this utter, like, connection of our humanity
Right.
that doesn't allow you to look at someone who has a different belief than you and dehumanize them and think you're morally superior and automatically say, I will say, since I wrote this book, I've had so many heartbreaking conversations with parents who are conservative, whose children, sometimes because of a spouse or a partner, has cut
Suffer
them
this a
off.
lot. A lot.
Yeah, and I mean, that's devastating. I will say too, though, I think it's about you know we could get into a whole other conversation. We're coming up on an hour and a half, so I don't want to get into too deep ones here. Like I said, I don't have a hard stop, but I do think, like, one of the things that has really really happened is that uh, feminism created a lot of challenges that we can't even talk about a
Right.
lot of these challenges. And part of that is that men have been emasculated in many ways, and a lot of men have raised weak boys who then face these girl boss young third wave feminists who then tell them, you're not talking to your parents anymore,
Mhm.
and they say, okay, dear. And this is a
Mhm.
lot of, and I these are multiple examples that I've had since writing the book, and it's a really challenging situation. I don't
It's
That's why I
entirely.
was hesitant to get into this, because this is a really, could be a 2-hour conversation in and of itself.
We can come
But
back and do that one.
we we
Because we do
can. I've
We're up to
already
about
turned my
chapter
feminist
four and a
card
half.
in, so I'm not
Huh?
afraid to lose it. I said I've already turned my feminist card in, so I'm not afraid to lose it. You know, because I think we have to be honest about some of these things.
Oh, yeah,
And
I agree.
as a woman, I can say some of these things that would get a lot of men in trouble for saying. Um, but I also view my story as a potential cautionary tale to young women to really be thinking about um, what you want out of your life, and that kind of thing. Um, because I also think that uh, you know we've sold a lot of young women a bill of goods about where meaning comes from. And this gets back to sort of the spiritual crisis when I said mental health and spiritual crisis.
Mhm.
And you know, uh, I'm not a religious person in that I don't belong to a church, but I have a very strong relationship with the Creator now, and you know that has changed a lot of things. You know, that's part of why a lot of people on the left don't have a sense of gratitude and forgiveness. Most spiritual and religious traditions teach you those two things,
Yeah.
and they instill them in you. And so, like, but where does meaning come from? I can guarantee you, after walking the halls of power and making the medium books that I used to get paid, it doesn't come from money and it doesn't come from your job. And so, uh, but that's what we chase, right? We chase status and we chase money. And at the end of the day, without any connection to our fellow humans or to our creator, where does our meaning come from? Um, Jamie has a saying that some people are so poor all they have is money.
Yeah.
And I think it's very true. So,
And I think that's a fantastic statement. I think one of we talk about the third wave of feminism, right? But I think one of the problems of the third wave of feminism, I have many problems with it, but one of which is it's told young women, you can be anything you want, except don't you dare choose to be a traditional woman, because that is not strong at all. And it demonizes that idea, which there are plenty of women left in this world that embrace that idea and want that. And to, we go back to how young men were raised the last decade of just being told that they're wrong with everything that's wrong in this world is their fault. That group of women being raised in to be more or wanting to be more traditional are attacked almost just as evenly.
yeah,
Wish these
that's
things
100%
were out
true.
of.
And, you
I wish.
know, my, I wasn't really raised that way, but part of what happened, I think, to me is that you know, I was a competitive debater, high school and college, over 90% male, probably 95% male when I participated in it. And part of what I learned or internalized was that I had to be more like a man to succeed. So all of these feminine qualities, which I hear young women saying, well, that's not feminine energy, that's not female energy. Yeah, it actually is, of kindness, of nurturing, of, um, you know, not necessarily submissiveness, but less, you know, aggressive. You know, all of those things are feminine energy. And I think that when we were told we're going to succeed in the men's world, a lot of us had to give up, thought we had to give up those things in order to be successful. And I think that was, this was back in the 80s. So we've come way from there to the point where um, I think there is a lot of discrimination against women who want to raise families. And you know, all the work I did 100 years from now, 25 years from now, no one's going to know anything about that. But you create a new life and you raise a good moral human, that's going to have a huge impact 25 years from now. And there's also a question of you know what have we done to young women so that these basic biological facts of, you know, whether you believe in God and the creation of us that is taught in, say, Christianity, or you believe in evolution, one of the most important things is reproducing and multiplying and continuing on the species. And if you talk to many young women, the idea that having a baby would be the most horrible thing that could ever happen to them and it would ruin their life, we have to ask ourselves about, where does that come from, and what does that really mean to us as a species and about our future? So,
Well, and I can say this as both of my children are adopted. You know, when you have an opportunity, even if you can't have your own children, there are plenty of other children out there who you could raise and nurture and, show that they're valued and life is worth living. And I think, I just always raised, and maybe it was just by my environment, that women and men have vastly different powers and they both work well together. And that doesn't mean that one's necessarily stronger than the other one, because you just look at the different attributes that get brought together, and it does create a pretty significant force. And again, there's no necessarily hard path for that, but that doesn't mean that it can't exist, right? There's no single right answer, but that doesn't mean that there's no answer either.
no, that's 100% true. And I think there are differences between men and women, and there should be, and we should stop pretending that there aren't. I'd be happy to sit here and tell you that if I were ever in a situation where a building is on fire and I'm trapped, I want the biggest, burliest man coming in to carry me out. I don't, that's not misogynistic. It's just fact.
Right.
That doesn't mean there can't be a great female firefighter,
Right.
but in general, men are
And,
stronger. That's
and
just true.
I'll take that to the next step. After he drags me out, I have absolutely zero issue with the doctor fixing me in the hospital being a woman, because I've had plenty of female doctors and usually I like them better than the males because they seem to pay more attention to what's actually going on. So that's a great example, because it's like, yeah, I can absolutely pick and choose certain places of who I want doing what, and I can show you why certain people are better at certain things than others, that, based on what you just said, is a great example.
But again, I've lost my feminist card for sure. No,
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, it gets
I'm
thrown
not in the
out.
club. I think,
How
but
do you
I
think
think
they feel about me if you think your card's gone? They would drag me behind the bus.
well, they would. But I think these are things that are fundamental questions as a society, as a culture, that we're failing to address. And we've gotten to a point where it's almost verboten forbidden to speak of these things. And again, it's like I'm a bad person or I have a moral failing because of this, as opposed to, well, wait a second, she's raising some good questions, and maybe she's older than I am and she has some experience and maybe some wisdom, maybe, that I could learn from.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really great point that, there are a lot of kids who could be adopted and need a home and need to be need love and those kind of things. At the same time, too, if a woman wants to have her own biological children,
Yeah.
she needs to um, recognize that it's not that easy when you get older to do that. And if you put your career first, you may find yourself, first of all, in a situation where it's going to be hard to find a man who wants you at that point, and that is not a failing on the man's part. You're going to be I don't want to go too far down the path. That may be challenging, but once you do, um, women's fertility and men's fertility is not the same as it used to be.
Right.
And there's a lot of factors, from the clothes that we wear to the food that we eat to the chemicals we're exposed to some of the medicine that we take or get injected with that can have a really negative effect on women's fertility. And so thinking that you're going to be in your late 30s and have an easy time getting pregnant, you might want to think again. And if that's a goal of yours, making different choices when you're younger, you can always go be bad boss mama if you want to in the
Absolutely.
workforce. But you're not always going to be able to find a life partner that you want to bring the next generation into existence with and be in a physical situation where you're able to do that. So, if you'd have told me I would be sitting here saying and most of these things that I've just said to you, Sean, when I was like 40, even maybe 45, I would have laughed at your face. I never want kids. This is silly. What are you talking about? My career's important. And now in retrospect, maybe I can help a few women make a different decision and create some different meaning in their life than I had.
Well, and that's obviously part of the awakening that led to this book. And it also sounds like that would be a pretty good podcast series for you to launch at some point. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah, we can talk about that at a different time. But
we get I just want to cover a few more things because I get about 17 minutes left before the software I think is going to get a little hokey on me. So I don't want to push it for too long.
okay.
Book wise, we're about 5 or 6 chapter wise. Tools of control. We talked about education and media and how they definitely are what indoctrinates these youth. And then you wrote a part that here it is. You're blunt about being the pandemic actually breaking you, and you told us the whole story about like how this didn't add up, and you're like all of a sudden, like you said, Jamie just kind of put it on you, and you get to this point where you had this awakening, and then it comes time to actually like fully deprogram yourself, which obviously is a big part of the book.
Yeah.
What did you do? Because I think that's a huge part of obviously this book. What steps did you take, or what approach did you have to that?
So what I did, and really it is, I just started thinking again, Sean, and that's really what it was. I gave myself permission to ask questions, and um, at some point, I stood there in front of Jamie and I stopped caring what other people thought about me. And I think that's a huge, I said, you know what? I care more about the truth than I do about whether someone likes me or not. I care more about the truth than I do about fitting into the mold that I have to fit into in order to be accepted by the community that I'm a part of. Um, and when he asked me that question, it caused my brain to start working again. And I think that is the big thing is ask your allow yourself to ask questions. Don't think of it as a moral failing that you're questioning the narrative or not believing the expert or um, humble yourself. Okay, and this is a big part of it because there's a
Yeah.
lot of ego in the elitism on the left. Humble yourself to the possibility that you're wrong. Humble yourself to the possibility that you don't know better. And that's a kick in the teeth. I mean, it is. It is a lot to do. But
Well, and I think
oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I think as a society, we're so used to other things humbling us, right? Other people sometimes humble us, or a situation, but I think to humble yourself, I think is just unbelievably hard to do. And I applaud you for that because, I mean, it takes a lot.
It really does. But I think, for me and for every person, it's going to be different because every person has different issues that they care about. I've seen other people, for example, who woke up because of what the media was saying and what they were being told. They lived in Western North Carolina, and after the storm there, when they were skipping houses with Trump flags, and when they were saying, oh, FEMA's here, they're doing all this great stuff. They saw with their own eyes that it was not happening. And they just couldn't buy the lies anymore. So why I say that is each person is going to have something different that wakes them up. And to me, it was, oh my God, the party that I have supported my entire life is censoring people. They're trying to create a ministry of truth, for Christ's sake. And I can't. I must look at myself. Am I right about these things? Are they right? And so it is about humbling yourself. It's about admitting the possibility that you're wrong. And it is about admitting the possibility that although it's scary, you have to form your own opinions. You can't trust anyone else to decide what's true for you. Because when you do, you leave yourself open to this, what I like to say is, and this is chapter 5, which is characteristics of people on the left that make them more susceptible. By and large, very compassionate. I'm an extremely compassionate person. I care about other people, but it's that very compassion that gets manipulated and weaponized using fear into anger. And it's where that moral superiority also comes from. Well, you don't care about that poor trans kid. You don't care about that, black person who will never get ahead because they're oppressed. You don't care. And it is about recognizing what the true compassion means and being willing to say, all right, you know what? We've had welfare for how many years? And are people actually doing better? Are they
What's it done?
actually improving? What has it done? And being open to the possibility that, more government isn't always better. And fundamentally, it is, for me, it was about remembering that the Constitution is what keeps us free, and ultimately we keep ourselves free because of what's embodied in the Constitution. But that, it was that at the blink of an eye, without even a conversation, our First Amendment rights to assemble, to associate, to speak, to worship when and where we please were gone.
Emergency declaration.
There's no emergency exception to the Constitution.
Right. But that's what people were told. It's an emergency declaration, so it's fine. This has to happen this way.
Right. No, but it was that realization. And then I had to say to myself, okay, if I was wrong about that, how do I know I'm right about anything else? It's extremely humbling. It's extremely scary. It's extremely, but it's asking questions again, and it's giving yourself permission to do that. And like you say, I say admitting you're wrong is never easy, but admitting you're wrong about everything is next to impossible.
Oof.
But if you want a free mind, you have to be open to that possibility.
Yeah. No, I think if you want a free mind, you should be open to all possibilities, right? And not to say I'm certainly perfect, because I know I have my limitations on certain things, and I know there are times that I've been caught in my own echo chamber. It's funny because I get about 5 people in my life, maybe 6 depending on the topic, that I know that I can go to and get a blunt, honest response when I say, hey, I'm thinking about this, or I look at it this way. And I may not like all the responses, but at least I know they're honest, right? And I try to do that every once in a while to kind of check myself, because I do worry about getting too far down a single path without listening to, it's why a lot of us on the right are actually giving Fetterman so much credit these days, where it's like, hey, he stepped away and he said this isn't right. And that takes a lot of, the running joke is a stroke isn't bad for everybody, right? He's putting up with a lot, and he's taken a lot of, the proverbial guns pointed at him for speaking up and being an individual and using his brain to actually make his decisions and not have them be made for him, which is what we see in Congress a lot.
Well, it is, and that could get into a whole other topic about the strength of the political parties and how much our founding fathers warned us against that,
Another
and
show.
factions. Another show, but but the point is, you're right, and I give him a lot of credit too. I really was astounded that he could get elected in where he was in terms of his stroke recovery when he did get elected, but
That was
he is certainly.
a little questionable.
Yeah, and as someone who worked on behalf of people with disabilities for 20 years, I I think that we have to be also realistic about people's limitations. And that doesn't mean he wasn't a good person. It doesn't mean I didn't think he could do lots of things. But I question whether he had the judgment to be making policy for a nation of 330 million people at that time.
Yeah,
And
when you put him up against who was in the White House at the time, he was flying high. I mean, he
well,
was
yeah,
sharper than a
so
tack. So
that's a whole other story. But the point being, the other thing I think that is how do people deprogram themselves is make yourself listen to people you disagree with and ask yourself to go beneath the talking points, beneath the top line argument, and justify what you believe.
I think that's
One of the things, I saw a bunch of interviews with the supposed No Kings protests. None of them could get below the talking points. None of them could, well, what's he done specifically that's unconstitutional? What's he done specifically? Well, he's not going to leave office. Okay. What's he done to make you believe that? All sorts of things. And, you know, it's hard for people to do. And I'll get into, because I know we're coming up on time, but like, what can you kind of do to help someone else wake up? And obviously, my story, there was a particular question that started my brain working again by creating that huge amount of cognitive dissonance. Well, asking questions is the only way to do it, in my opinion, is to get people started. And the hard part is that either the question can't presuppose an answer, right? Or it can't use facts that they might disagree with. The particular question for me used facts that I already agreed with, right? So it's asking a question, and it does a few things. Because of the fact that a lot of them have no spiritual or religious faith on the left, they're seeking external validation in a way that often conservatives and independent thinkers, and especially very religious people, don't need, because they get that validation from God. They get it from their creator. But when you ask a question in a very non-confrontational way, you're showing that you care about their opinion. You're validating them in a way that allows them to potentially think. And it again starts to get their brain moving, and often those questions can lead to another question. It's the Socratic method. It's what they use in law school.
yep.
It's what a lot of philosophers will use, and a lot of other kinds of teachers. But so, a basic question might mean, what does freedom mean to you? I'm just trying to understand, what does freedom of speech mean to you? Is it important? Why or why not?
Right.
And these are the kind of things that can lead you on a path that allow them to start considering the possibility that some things they believe might be questionable. And then, the other thing to keep in mind is that it's very unlikely you're ever going to get someone who is indoctrinated or brainwashed to admit in a conversation that you're right, or that they're wrong.
Right.
What's more likely, and most likely, and won't be a surprise to anyone, I don't think, is that they'll start calling you a name, or yelling at you. But wear it as a badge of honor and don't take it personally. Because if you have tried this approach where you're being very nice, you're asking questions, you're not yelling, then that means that you have pushed them into a corner in their brain and they are reacting to protect the delusion. They are reacting to prevent their brain from going into that rabbit hole that they will never come out of the same. And so you've actually gotten through. Take it as a badge of honor. Be kind still, and know that you might have planted a seed, and maybe it's not the first seed, and that eventually that seed may germinate and that person may wake up. I wish I could say, here's the playbook 1, 2, 3, either for a person or for people who are trying to help a person. It's just none of us that were indoctrinated. And I should say there are people who are programmed and indoctrinated on the right as well. And that's a whole different thing. But that's not my experience. But no two people were indoctrinated or brainwashed in the same way. No two people have the same issues that they care about. And so it's going to be an individualized process. Often takes a lot of time. And just be prepared that when people wake up, it's ugly. It's not pretty. It's, most of the people I've talked to who have woken up, there is a period of depression. There is a period of, well, if I'm not that, who the heck am I? And how did this happen to me? And how do I learn to trust my gut again? How do I learn to trust my brain again? How do I learn to trust people again? Because we didn't get into this at all, and it's probably for the best, but who did this to me? Right? And those people are still out there. And how do I know I can prevent it from happening again? Maybe on the other side, right?
Yeah.
And, what I came down to is we're in a spiritual battle, good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
And there's good on both sides of the political aisle, and there's evil on both sides of the political aisle. And how do I learn to trust my gut and my intuition and my heart again to understand that? And one of the other final suggestions that I make, that I will make, there's others in the book, but is if you're trying to wake up or you're trying to make sense of all of this and you're not a religious person, explore your faith. Explore how to become more connected. Ask yourself why you aren't. Ask yourself what that means. And ask yourself if you really think that what you believe is science is actually proven any more than someone's belief in a higher power. And, explore that, because the more connected we can become to our Creator, however we envision that, the more connected we will be to one another, the harder it will be to make us afraid and use divide and conquer to control us.
And I think people, even not being deprogrammed, should ask themselves that question. We got to wrap up Deprogramming Democrats.com and at Deprogrammed Dem on X, Lisa Ekman. We're going to have you back a lot because I think there's so much more to dig in. Obviously, we do this, we can converse pretty well. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And back to Sean. Thanks, Sean. So that was Lisa's interview. It was outstanding. For a lot of people who don't realize, it was a 2-hour interview. It was only supposed to be an hour. She was so gracious with her time, and I was so thankful for that. And we also talked for about a half an hour before we even started recording. So that tells you that she is an open book. And speaking of books, you can go get hers, deprogramingdemocrats.com, if you want to buy a copy. I'm about halfway through the whole book. I've scanned through front and back, getting ready for this interview. She sent me a copy graciously. Thank you again, Lisa. And I tell you that I think it's something that you should take a look at. It's something that it just helps you kind of understand who you're dealing with. When you're dealing with these hardcore Democrats, when you're dealing with these hardcore progressive leftists, this gives you great insight into why they are the way they are. Some things we all kind of see on this side of the aisle, and some things you don't. So go check it out, deprogrammingdemocrats.com. The author's name is Lisa Ekman. And thank you so much for sitting through this interview. And thank you to everybody in chat. We had some great chatters this evening. I appreciate you being here. And I will be back Wednesday night, 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 on the East Coast, right here on the SHI Media Network. But not just me. Yeah, check out all the other great hosts on SHR Media. Monday and Friday, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 on the East Coast. You have you have Reaver of Common Sense with Jersey Joe. Tuesday and Thursday morning, 9 a.m. Pacific, noon on the East Coast. You have Mission Ready Men with Big E. Tuesday, Thursday nights, BZ's Berserk Bobcat Saloon at 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 on the East Coast. Sundays at 5 p.m., you have the Lost Wanderers show on our YouTube. Check that out as well. And special thanks to our friends over at KLRN Radio for carrying me. I will see you Wednesday night. I hope you have a great couple of days.